Welcome to part 11. Today we're talking about photo editing. Okay, we need to start by talking about something that's going to make your photo editing a lot easier. You may have noticed in my earlier videos that whenever you see the back of my camera, in the bottom left there are the letters RAW. Now that is the type of file that I choose to take my photos in, as opposed to JPEGs, which is the default that your camera will come set to. Now, what is RAW and why do I choose to shoot in RAW? Well, when we shoot in RAW, we are actually capturing a lot more information on the camera, roughly 3 times as much information as we are capturing when we shoot in JPEGs. And what this means is when we come to edit our photos, we have a lot more latitude, a lot more flexibility in what we can do to improve the appearance of our photos. And this is most noticeable when you're editing, let's say, an outdoor shot, and it may be that the ground is perfectly exposed, but the sky, rather than looking blue and there being clouds visible in the sky, it may be that in your shot the sky just looks completely white. That means that it's overexposed. Now, if we shoot in RAW, to a certain degree we can bring down the brightness of the sky and bring out some of that detail in the sky. It may be we can pull back some of the blue in the sky, and we can make the clouds visible. Now, if we were shooting in JPEG, we've got a lot less latitude for things like that, where part of the image is too bright, part is too dark, and so it's generally advisable to shoot in RAW if you think that you'll be editing your photos at some point in the future. However, there are some downsides to RAW files. As I mentioned, RAW files are a lot larger, so they require more storage space when you're backing up your photos. Generally, RAW files are less easy to open. A lot of laptops and tablets and phones won't open RAW files without you first installing an extra bit of software, so they're a bit less convenient. But if you are going to edit your photos, I strongly recommend that you shoot in RAW. Now, if you're a little bit concerned by this and you're familiar with JPEGs and you know that they'll always open in software that you use, if your camera allows it, you may wish to shoot in what's called RAW plus JPEG. So every time you hit the shutter button, the camera will capture both a RAW file and a JPEG file. The advantage to that being that you've got the convenience of the JPEG that you can easily open and upload if you want to do that, but you've also got the RAW file there, so should you want to go back and do a proper edit on the photo at some future point, you've got that as well. So moving on to photo editing, I've picked a few photos from a recent trip to France. I'm going to show you how I go about editing my photos. I'll be using Lightroom, but I don't want to get too deeply into the ins and outs of Lightroom because you may choose to use different software. If I'm just editing on the go and I want to quickly edit a photo and upload it to, let's say, Instagram, I'll typically use a piece of software called Snapseed. So rather than going through the specifics that are particular to Lightroom, I'll be taking you through some of the basic editing principles which can be applied to various different photo editing software solutions. So just kicking off with this photo of a beach in the south of France, and I picked this particular photo because you may have noticed that the horizon is not level in this shot, which is a very common mistake that I see. Even seasoned photographers I see taking photos like this and not correcting them. So the first thing I tend to do when I'm editing a photo is I will tend to do a bit of cropping Now if you happen to be using Lightroom, you just hit the R key and this gives us a grid. Now when I took this photo, I tried to observe the rule of thirds that I introduced you to in an earlier video, whereby rather than putting the horizon smack bang in the middle of the photo, I aimed to put it roughly a third from the top of the screen. Now you may choose to have 2/3 sky and a third sea, or as I've done here, a third sky, 2/3 sea and sand. It really depends on what works for that particular situation. But you can see that the horizon is not quite on that line here, and you can also see that it is not perfectly horizontal. So to correct that, I will just rotate the image slightly to make it horizontal, and I'm just going to size it down a bit so that we get that horizon correct, and we make it a 1/3, 2/3 split. That looks about right. Just hit the return key. So I'm not going to be too particular about this, it's just to quickly show you what I do. So that's roughly horizontal now, and we've got a third of sky and 2/3 of sea and sand. Over to the right of the screen, we've got our various sliders. If we scroll down, there's a lot more sliders down here, but most of what we're going to do is in this first section here. First thing I'll usually do is I'll take my highlights down, and what that's going to do is, as I mentioned earlier, if we've got a sky that's blown out, that's completely white, that'll sometimes bring back some of the detail in the sky. Now this photo is more evenly exposed, so this isn't going to be a great example of what the highlight slider can do, but we've not lost anything by pulling that down, and it is giving us a little more detail in the sky. If I go to the other end of the scale, you can see the effect a bit more clearly. So I'll bring my highlights down. So that slider there is only impacting on the brightest parts of the image. If I want to bring the overall brightness of the image down, I can just use the exposure slider, which I think is pretty much as it should be. Maybe just bring it down a tad. If there was any particularly dark areas to the image, by bringing the shadow slider up, we can reveal the detail in those shadow areas. So most of this is just trial and error really. It's what looks right to your eye. There's no definite right and wrong with photo editing. I'm going to just pull that exposure back up a little bit. Now what I think is going to make a big impact on this image is to boost up the colour levels. So I'm going to just notch up the saturation and see what that does. And you can see that we're getting the purples and the blues starting to come through, and the yellows quite clearly there. Now if I want to be a bit more localized in my adjustment, I can put in what we call a graduated filter. So if I click on this button here, and again most bits of software will do this, click at the top of the screen and hold the left mouse button and then drag down. I can make changes just to that top section of the image. Now at the moment we are bringing down the exposure, but I think I'm going to add some saturation to that sky. If we add it just to the sky, it doesn't look quite so artificial because we're not impacting on the entire image. And I think a little more contrast is going to bring out those clouds. And let me just show you what clarity does. If you go right down and right back up, again it brings a bit more definition to the sky there. Click on the graduated filter again to go back to our main sliders that affect the entire image. I'm going to bring up the colour in the entire image. And it really is just trial and error. A bit more contrast. Now the image is starting to look a little bit dark overall, so go back to exposure, bring that up a bit. You may want to add a bit of sharpness, so if you scroll right down here, we've got a sharpening slider here. And with just a few clicks there, I think you can see that it's made quite a dramatic difference to the image. If I show you the before and the after, that's really quite dramatic with just a few minor tweaks. Okay, let's try another image. Okay, this is a good example of sky being overexposed. I mean, this sky I remember was quite impressive. There was some nice reds and yellows and blues in the sky. The sun was just setting, but the camera has exposed for this area here, and in doing so it's brightened up the image, which has made our sky way too bright. So if I go back to my highlights slider, I'm expecting that by bringing this down all the way, I'm starting to get some of that detail back. Let's just try bringing the exposure of the whole image down a little. And we'll give it a little saturation boost. Now, you can go crazy if you want to. Again, there's no hard and fast rules. If I'm uploading to, say, Instagram, I'll tend to go a little bit stronger with the edit, make it a little bit more eye-catching, a bit less lifelike, a bit more surreal. But again, it's purely to your taste. If I want to get a bit more localized, again, I can add a graduated filter. So that we're only really impacting the sky. And then we can choose what that filter does, whether it brings the exposure down or boosts the saturation, the contrast, perhaps brings the highlights down. And that will do for that one, I think. Now if I want to bring the foreground up but leave the sky looking similar, I can boost the shadows. And then we start to get an image that looks more how we would have seen it with the human eye than the photo as it started, which was that. Again, just a quick edit, but you can see how significant the difference is there. Moving on to the next photo. Now, here I haven't observed the rule of thirds quite so well. Let's hit the crop button. But of course we can make quite dramatic changes to our crop, and we don't necessarily need to stick with a conventional ratio. Let's go for a wide shot on this photo. I can probably afford to lose some of what's going on to the right there. Let's make sure the horizon is straight. Somewhere about there is right. And this photo to me is screaming out for a bit of a colour boost, because we had some great pinks and purples going on that evening in France. Let's just give it a bit of a saturation boost. Have a little play with exposure, see where we feel that should be. And that's nice. Contrast, just add a smidge. Try bringing the highlights down. We're a little heavy on the saturation. And let's just see what the before looked like. Again, quite a dramatic change just with a few clicks. Final photo. Okay, I'm going to start again with the cropping. I don't know that the people in the foreground are really adding a great deal to the shot. Got quite a lot of wall over to the right there that isn't really adding a great deal to the image. I'm going to just make the vertical lines a little bit more straight. Hit the return key, and the sky is screaming out for a bit of detail. Pull the highlights down and you can see straight away we get the blue coming back in the sky. If we were using a JPEG here, we perhaps wouldn't have had so much success with that. This area around here is really quite dark. I'd like to bring that up by pulling up the shadow slider. I'm going to bring the brightness of the entire image down a smidge. Add a bit more colour. You can add a bit of sharpening if you want. Be careful not to overdo it, because if we over sharpen then we can start to make the photo look a bit noisy and grainy. But for just a quick edit, I think you'll see that that's quite a dramatic improvement. Now, there are much more complex things that you can do with this software. We can get very localized with our editing by using a brush tool. So we can, if I just illustrate by darkening the sky here, just make a messy job of it, you can see that you can be quite specific with where your changes are going to be made within the image. I'll just do that bit there just to illustrate, and then if I decide that that's too much, I can pull back on that. And I might want to boost the saturation perhaps. Again, I'm just doing part of the sky here, but you get the idea. So it's a very powerful tool, and photo editing software is a lot more powerful if you are working with RAW files rather than JPEGs. Anyway, I hope that was of some use to you. It was just a very brief introduction to how you might want to edit your photos, plus a couple of tips on composition. If this video was useful, I'd be very grateful if you would give it a quick thumbs up, share it, please comment. I'm always happy to receive comments and to reply to them. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.